I had been planning this solo camping trip for months, carefully choosing the spot, packing everything I thought I would need, and mentally preparing myself for a night deep in the wilderness. The area I chose was far from the usual crowded campsites. A small clearing I had found on a topographic map, tucked away in a forest that stretched endlessly for miles. I drove up as far as the road allowed, then hoisted my pack and hiked the last 2 miles. The sun was dipping low behind the hills, casting long shadows over the dense pine trees, and I could feel the cool evening air brushing against my skin as I stepped into the clearing. The first thing I did was find a good place for my tent. The ground was uneven and covered with a mix of pine needles and loose soil. I picked a spot near a large, leaning oak, its thick branches forming a natural canopy. I cleared the ground of rocks and sticks, laid down my tent, and secured it as best I could. I wanted to make sure it wouldn't collapse in case of wind, because out here, there would be no one to help if it did. Once the tent was up, I set up my small portable stove, took out some water, and started boiling it for dinner. As I ate, I felt a strange mixture of peace and unease. The forest was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Sure, I could hear the occasional bird or the rustle of a small animal in the underbrush, but there was an underlying stillness that made every snap of a twig sound sharp and urgent. I tried to focus on the mundane tasks, packing up the food, checking my gear, making sure my flashlight had fresh batteries, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just the isolation, that the mind tends to play tricks when you are alone in the wild. After dinner, I decided to take a short walk to stretch my legs before nightfall. I wandered along a faint trail that led deeper into the forest. The trees grew closer together here, and the fading light made shadows dance across the trunks in ways that made them look like moving shapes. I kept my flashlight ready, shining it on the path ahead, but I didn't go too far. I wanted to see how far I could walk before it got too dark to find my way back. Something about the sound of the forest changed as the last rays of sunlight disappeared. The gentle evening noises, the wind in the trees, the distant bird calls, shifted into a heavier, more deliberate silence. Every movement I made seemed louder than it should, each crack of a branch beneath my boot echoing unnaturally through the trees. I slowed my pace, listening, trying to convince myself that it was only the forest settling, only the night taking over. When I finally turned back toward my campsite, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. In the distance, a faint movement between the trees caught my eye, like a shadow that didn't belong. I froze, holding my breath, trying to determine if it was an animal or just a trick of the light. Whatever it was, it moved with a deliberate, cautious rhythm, staying just far enough away to be hard to identify. I felt a cold sweat start at the back of my neck. Out here, in a place no one else would find me for miles, even a small miscalculation could be dangerous. I picked up my pace, keeping my flashlight steady, aiming it at every shape that shifted in the darkness. The shadow disappeared whenever I tried to focus directly on it, but I could feel its presence. The unease built into a knot in my stomach, making me hyper-aware of every sound. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the faint scuff of something moving against the underbrush. By the time I reached my tent, my hands were shaking slightly. I quickly zipped it closed and double-checked the guy lines, the stakes, and my supplies. I spent the next hour trying to calm myself. I ate some snacks, sipped water, and tried to convince myself that the shadow was probably a deer or another animal passing by. I kept my flashlight near my bedroll, ready to grab at a moment's notice. Still, sleep didn't come easily. Every small sound made me jolt awake, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Around midnight, I woke to a new noise, a rustling, slow and deliberate, right outside my tent. It wasn't the quick movement of a deer or squirrel. This was methodical, like something or someone was circling, testing the perimeter. I stayed still, my heart hammering, ears straining to catch every detail. The rustling stopped suddenly, and then I heard the faintest sound of breathing. I didn't move. I didn't dare. Every instinct told me to run, but running blindly into the forest could be worse than whatever was outside. I reached slowly for my flashlight, careful not to make any noise. When I flicked it on, the beam cut through the dark, illuminating the clearing. First, there was nothing. Then I saw them, footprints in the loose soil around my tent. They were human, not animal, fresh, leading from the tree line directly to my tent. I realized then that I wasn't alone. Someone had been watching me for who knew how long, waiting until night fell. My stomach turned. The realization brought with it a paralyzing fear. This wasn't just a random hiker or camper. Whoever it was knew I was alone and vulnerable. My mind raced, thinking through every possible escape, every way to protect myself. I had a small knife, a flashlight, and my wits. I didn't have a phone signal, no way to call for help. I stayed in the tent, listening as the movements continued outside. Every few minutes, there was a soft step or a deliberate shift in the underbrush. My mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe they would leave, but deep down I knew that someone was circling, studying me, waiting. The hours crawled by, each one heavier than the last. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. By the time the first light of morning filtered through the trees, I could barely remember my own name from the fear and exhaustion. The noises had stopped sometime in the night, leaving a tense silence behind. I waited for what felt like an eternity, too scared to leave, afraid that moving would provoke whoever had been out there. When I finally dared to unzip the tent and look outside, I saw the tracks again. They led to my food supply, my stove, and even around the tent, marking every area I had settled. Whoever had been there was thorough, observing everything. But there was no one in sight now, just the morning birds and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. I packed up quickly, leaving behind anything that could attract attention. I followed the faint trail back toward the road, scanning constantly, moving as fast as I dared without making noise. I kept thinking I saw shadows moving just beyond the trees, but it was impossible to tell if it was my imagination or something real. Every snap of a branch made me freeze, my body tensing, ready to react. Hours later, I finally emerged onto the road. The forest stretched endlessly behind me, but I had made it out. My hands were scratched and raw from grabbing branches. My clothes were torn, and my heart still pounded from the adrenaline. I kept walking until I reached a small town, where I finally found a phone signal and called someone to come get me. In the days after, I thought about what happened over and over. I couldn't see who had been circling me, and there were no answers, no signs beyond the tracks. But the fear I felt was real, and it stayed with me. I learned, in the most visceral way, that being alone in the wild isn't just about surviving nature. It's about surviving other people, too. The memory of those footprints, the deliberate rustling, the shadow just beyond the trees, stayed with me long after I returned to safety. I never camped alone again. I never went back to that forest. And though I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was a random trespasser or some local scouting the area, I never forgot the feeling of someone silently watching me in the dark, waiting for a mistake. The experience changed how I approached the wilderness forever, teaching me that preparation isn't just about equipment or knowledge. It's about understanding the real risks, even the ones that lurk in human form. I had been planning this camping trip for months, scouring maps, reading guidebooks, checking weather forecasts, and making sure I had every piece of equipment I thought I might need. I wanted to get away from everything. The city, the constant noise, the people, the obligations, and disappear into the forest for a week. I told myself it would be peaceful, a chance to reset my mind and body, but what I didn't anticipate was how unforgiving the wilderness could be when you weren't fully prepared, or even when you thought you were. I chose a national forest several hours from the nearest town. The road in was rough but navigable, winding through thick pines and past small, clear streams. By the time I parked my car at the trailhead, the sun was already dipping toward the horizon. The forest smelled of wet pine needles and earth, and the air was crisp, carrying that distinct scent of untouched nature that I'd missed so much in the city. I had my backpack with the essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, stove, water filter, food, a first aid kit, flashlight, extra batteries, and a compass. I even had a map spread out in my lap as I walked the trail, checking markers and estimating how far I could go before nightfall. I had picked a campsite not far from a small lake that the maps labeled as pristine and secluded. It was a reasonable distance from the main trail, which I thought would give me solitude but not leave me entirely isolated. The path was uneven, full of exposed roots and slick patches of moss. I stumbled a few times but quickly caught myself. The forest grew darker with every step. Shadows stretched long in the last light of the day, and the sound of my own footsteps felt unnaturally loud. Birds had gone quiet, and the occasional rustle of leaves sounded sharp and close. By the time I reached the clearing by the lake, the sun had almost vanished, leaving the sky a deep purple. I set up my tent carefully, hammering stakes into the rocky soil, and unrolled my sleeping bag. I stacked some dry wood I had collected for a small fire and set it just outside the tent. I liked being prepared, and I wanted the fire to last until I felt secure enough to sleep. The first night was quiet, but not in a comforting way. The sounds of the forest, leaves rustling, branches creaking, distant animal calls, seemed louder and more deliberate in the darkness. I had brought a small journal and a pen, thinking I would write down my thoughts, but soon realized I didn't feel like writing. I just sat by the fire, staring at the flickering flames and listening. Occasionally, a fish would jump in the lake, breaking the mirrored surface with a soft splash. My stomach tightened when I heard a sharp crack in the distance, like a branch snapping under pressure. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe even a bear, but I made sure my food was stored away safely in a backpack hung from a tree. That night, I slept lightly, waking often at the smallest noises, my heart thumping with every snap or rustle. The next day, I decided to explore the surrounding area, carrying just a small pack with water, snacks, and my compass. The forest was dense in some places, with thick underbrush and fallen trees that created natural obstacles. I carefully picked my way over logs and around brush, trying to stay aware of my bearings. The further I went, the quieter the forest became. Birds were few and even insects seemed subdued. By afternoon, I realized I had wandered further than I intended. I stopped to check my compass and map, and the sinking feeling hit me. I had lost the trail. I tried retracing my steps, moving slowly and deliberately, but everything began to look the same. Tall pines with rough bark, moss-covered rocks, uneven forest floor. There was no obvious landmark. Anxiety crept in, a tight, churning feeling in my stomach. I reminded myself to stay calm, to think logically. I marked the trees with small pieces of fabric from my pack, hoping it would help guide me back. I began walking in a straight line, hoping it would eventually lead me to the lake. But as night approached, I realized I was still disoriented. I set up a temporary shelter in a small clearing, using a tarp I had brought and some fallen branches. My hands shook as I built it, adrenaline making every movement tense. I gathered dry twigs and leaves for a small fire, but the wood was damp, and smoke choked my eyes more than it warmed me. Darkness fell fast, and with it the forest changed. The shadows seemed more menacing. Every sound made me startle. The wind brushing through the trees, the distant howl of a coyote, a branch falling somewhere out of sight. Sleep was impossible. I stayed awake for most of the night, shivering, my mind running through worst-case scenarios. By morning, my first priority was finding water. I followed a faint trickle downhill and found a small stream. I used my water filter and drank sparingly. I ate a little food but didn't feel hungry. Fear had dulled my appetite. I realized then that I had underestimated the forest. It was easy to get lost, even with maps and compass, and easy to make mistakes that could become serious problems quickly. The next 2 days were a slow, careful navigation effort. I marked my path, left visible indicators, and stayed near water sources in case I needed them. I began to ration my food more strictly, knowing that help could be far away. The nights were worse. Without the comfort of a proper campsite, I had to sleep partially exposed, always listening for predators, always on edge. One night, I awoke to the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Not human, but heavy, deliberate, moving through the brush around me. I froze. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, only hear it circling, sometimes stopping, then moving again. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure it would give away my position. Eventually, the sounds faded, and I was left trembling in the darkness, unsure if it had been a deer, a bear, or something else entirely. I never slept more than short stretches after that. On the fourth day, I made a critical decision. I had been trying to navigate back the way I thought I had come, but the forest seemed to shift and confuse me at every turn. I decided to head downhill, reasoning that eventually water would lead to a larger stream or a road. It was a dangerous choice. Steep, slippery slopes, loose rocks, and the constant risk of injury, but I felt I had no other options. I moved slowly, deliberately, testing each foothold, my backpack sliding and catching on branches. Around midday, I slipped on a wet rock and twisted my ankle badly. Pain shot through my leg and I fell to the ground. I was alone, several miles from my car, and my mobility was severely reduced. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I focused on breathing, on keeping calm. I knew that moving carelessly could worsen the injury. I rested, using my hands to stabilize myself, then decided to crawl slowly toward the sound of running water I thought I could hear nearby. Each movement was agonizing. My ankle swelled quickly, and every step made me wince. I spent the next several hours crawling and slowly moving downhill. Exhaustion set in. My arms ached from supporting my weight. My clothes were soaked with sweat and dirt, and my body was sore from both the injury and the constant tension. But eventually, I found a wider stream. I followed it, using it as a guide, moving cautiously around slippery rocks and fallen branches. By late afternoon, I spotted something in the distance. A small dirt road, partially overgrown, leading out of the forest. Relief hit me so hard that I felt tears prick at my eyes. I dragged myself toward it, my body screaming in protest. Once I reached the road, I collapsed, exhausted, and took stock. I could see tire tracks from vehicles, and I knew that if I stayed on this road, someone would eventually come. I had water with me, so I rested, drank, and tried to regain some strength. A few hours later, a car came down the road. I waved frantically, crawling toward it as best I could. The driver stopped, helped me into the car, and called for an ambulance. The relief, the feeling of being safe, hit me in waves I hadn't expected. I was shaken but alive. I spent a week recovering in the hospital for dehydration, minor cuts, and a badly sprained ankle. I learned later that the forest I had chosen was notorious for how easy it was to become disoriented. Experienced hikers had gotten lost there before, some even had to be airlifted out. I realized that my careful planning had helped me survive, but that small mistakes and misjudgments could have been fatal. In the end, I walked away with a newfound respect for the wilderness. I knew that nature was beautiful and peaceful, but it was also dangerous and unpredictable. I learned that preparation wasn't just about equipment. It was about awareness, humility, and knowing your limits. That experience stayed with me long after I left the hospital. I never camped alone in unfamiliar wilderness again. When I finally returned to the city, I appreciated the simple safety of streets, lights, and people. I kept camping as a hobby, but I always remembered that week. The fear, the pain, the exhaustion, and finally, the relief of survival. It was a lesson I would never forget. Respect the forest, prepare for the worst, and always be aware that nature doesn't forgive mistakes. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. I needed time away from the city, away from people, away from the noise and constant pressure of work. The plan was simple: drive a few hours into the mountains, find a trailhead, and spend a week in the wilderness with nothing but a tent, my backpack, and a few supplies. I had hiked before, but never alone for more than a night, and never in such a remote area. I thought I was prepared. I thought I had thought of everything. I hadn't. I arrived at the trailhead mid-morning on a clear autumn day. The air was crisp, with that sharp bite that hinted at the winter to come. The mountains rose ahead of me, covered in a thick forest of pine and aspen, their leaves bright gold and red in the sunlight. A small parking lot was empty except for my car, which I locked and left the engine off. The trailhead had a map, a few signs warning about bears, and a hand-painted notice about staying on the trail. I studied it carefully, making mental notes of the distances and landmarks. The path into the forest was narrow, winding, and littered with fallen leaves that crunched underfoot. The first few miles were calm. Birds chirped, leaves rustled in the wind, and I felt the familiar rhythm of hiking. The steady movement, the rise and fall of my breathing, the occasional glance at the map to check my progress. I kept my backpack snug against my shoulders. It was heavy, but manageable. I had packed enough food for 7 days, a sleeping bag, a small stove, water, and emergency supplies. I felt ready. By late afternoon, I had reached a flat clearing beside a small stream. It was perfect for setting up camp. I picked a spot on slightly elevated ground to avoid the dampness, away from any obvious animal tracks. I pitched my tent carefully, making sure the stakes were secure, the rainfly tight, and the flap zipped properly. I collected firewood nearby, selecting dry pieces of wood and smaller kindling. I knew that starting a fire at night would be crucial, not just for warmth but for safety. As the sun began to dip behind the mountains, the forest changed. Shadows stretched across the trail, the wind picked up, and the birds became quiet. I started a small fire and boiled water for dinner. The flames crackled and hissed, sending sparks into the darkening sky. I ate slowly, savoring the quiet, the isolation, the feeling that I was completely on my own in the wilderness. Night fell fast. The temperature dropped sharply, and I zipped myself into the sleeping bag after dousing the fire. Lying there in the darkness, I could hear the forest in a new way. The occasional snap of a twig, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant call of an owl. My mind was alert, attentive to every sound. I had chosen a safe spot, I reminded myself. I had checked for bear tracks, kept my food in a bear-proof container, and hung it from a tree. I was cautious. I was careful. Around midnight, I woke to a sound that made my stomach twist. A loud crack like a heavy branch snapping. It was not small, not distant. It was close. I froze, listening. My heart started to race. The snapping sound came again, followed by a low rustle, slow and deliberate, moving through the underbrush near the stream. I held my breath, trying to locate it. The forest seemed to hold its own breath, too, waiting. My first thought was a deer, maybe a bear. I had no way to know from the darkness, but instinct told me to stay still. The sound continued intermittently for hours. Every time I thought it had stopped, it would start again, closer this time, circling my tent. I had left my flashlight and a small knife within reach, and I gripped the knife, my hands shaking. I reminded myself to stay calm, to make no sudden movements. Bears are sensitive to motion and noise. I whispered silently to myself, trying to rationalize the sounds. Wind could snap branches. An animal could be moving through the leaves. But deep down, I knew this was not just a random sound. Something was out there, close, aware of me. Morning came slowly. The first light filtered through the trees, and I emerged from the tent, tense but relieved to see nothing immediately around me. I inspected the campsite. The fire had burned down, but the ashes were undisturbed. My food bag was untouched. No footprints, nothing. I told myself it had been my imagination, but the fear lingered, a tight knot in my chest. I decided to continue the hike, planning to move to a second campsite deeper in the mountains. The forest was quieter in daylight, but the silence was heavy, oppressive. Every rustle, every snap of a twig made me flinch. I tried to focus on the trail, on my steps, on the rhythm of walking. By late afternoon, I reached another clearing. It was more exposed than the first, with fewer trees for cover. I set up the tent quickly, feeling the weight of exhaustion in my legs. I collected firewood, choosing a pile of dry sticks and branches. As I worked, I noticed something strange. A set of tracks leading through the clearing, too large to be a deer, too deliberate to be random. They were fresh, the mud still soft. My stomach sank. I spent the rest of the day in a heightened state of awareness, constantly checking the perimeter of the campsite. The wind carried every sound, every movement, and I felt like I was being watched. I stayed close to the fire, kept my knife and flashlight within reach, and did not attempt to cook a proper meal. That night was worse than the first. The sounds returned, sharper this time, closer, almost circling my tent. I tried to stay calm, focusing on my breathing, telling myself that any animal that approached would be scared off by the fire and noise. But there was something different this time. Something patient, waiting. The snapping of branches was irregular, deliberate, and seemed to be studying me. I stayed inside the tent, shivering from both cold and fear, listening to the forest and counting the minutes until dawn. By morning, I knew I could not stay. The tracks were still there, more numerous, leading into the forest in a pattern that suggested movement and intelligence. I packed up quickly, leaving the campsite in as little time as possible. My hike back was slow, careful, always alert. Every shadow, every sound seemed magnified. Every step on the trail felt like it could reveal something hidden. As the hours passed, I noticed signs that confirmed my fear. Broken branches, claw marks on tree trunks, and the occasional large footprint pressed into the soft soil. I realized that I had been camping in an area frequented by a large predator, likely a bear, and judging by the tracks, it had been aware of me from the beginning. Panic threatened to take over, but I forced myself to stay calm, focusing on keeping a steady pace and avoiding sudden movements. By late afternoon, I reached a ridge overlooking the main trail that led to the parking lot. I could see the small glint of my car in the distance. Relief washed over me, but I remained cautious, scanning the surrounding forest for movement. Every sound still made me tense, but I kept moving, making my way down the trail carefully. As I approached the parking lot, I noticed one last sign of the bear, or whatever had been following me. A large set of tracks circled around the edge of the clearing, then disappeared into the underbrush, as if it had been watching me leave. I did not look back. I reached my car, unlocked it, and climbed in, shutting the doors with a trembling hand. My body was exhausted, my mind still racing, but I was safe. The drive back to civilization was tense, every noise from the car or the forest along the road making me jump. I didn't stop until I was back in the city, back among people, back in familiar surroundings. That night, I slept deeply, finally allowing my body to relax, knowing I had survived the most frightening experience of my life. Looking back, I understand how lucky I was. I had respected the forest, I had stayed cautious, and I had maintained awareness. That experience taught me the real meaning of isolation, the quiet, patient danger of nature, and the importance of preparation and vigilance. I never camped alone in that area again, and I never underestimated the forest. That trip left a permanent mark on me, a mixture of fear, respect, and awe for the raw power of the wilderness. I had always enjoyed camping alone. The quiet of the woods, the feeling of being small under the towering pines, the way the air smelled of damp earth and dry leaves. These things made me feel alive. That weekend, I had planned a trip deep into a national forest I had read about but never visited. It was a place far from roads, far from cell service, where people rarely ventured. I wanted the isolation. I wanted to see if I could survive on my own for a few days to test myself. I packed carefully, taking extra water, dried food, a sturdy tent, a sleeping bag, a portable stove, and a good first aid kit. My backpack was heavy, but I didn't mind. The feeling of being self-sufficient made it worth it. The first day was easy. The hike in was long, about 6 miles over uneven terrain, through thick forest and across a couple of shallow streams. The air was crisp and smelled of wet leaves and moss. The sun was high when I found a small clearing that seemed perfect for my camp. It was on a slight rise, surrounded by pines and oaks, with a stream running just beyond the edge of the clearing. I set up my tent carefully, making sure it was stable and secure. I gathered firewood and laid out my supplies in an organized manner. There was a feeling of accomplishment as I looked around at the quiet, the untouched forest. Everything seemed perfect. By late afternoon, I had a small fire going. I cooked a simple meal, instant noodles with some dried vegetables. The warmth of the fire, the smell of the cooking, and the sound of the stream nearby made me feel relaxed. I watched the shadows stretch long across the clearing as the sun sank behind the trees. Birds called to one another, and somewhere in the distance, I heard the faint rustle of larger animals moving through the underbrush. I wasn't worried. I knew to respect wildlife and to keep my food secured. I had done my research. Night fell quickly. The forest became darker than I expected. The canopy above blocked almost all the moonlight, and even the stars seemed faint through the dense foliage. I made sure my fire was stable and surrounded it with rocks. I ate a small snack, drank water, and prepared for sleep. The quiet was almost overwhelming. Every sound was amplified: the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening. It was peaceful, yet there was an edge to it, a tension in the absolute isolation. Around midnight, I woke to a strange sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, branches brushing against one another. But the sound persisted, a slow, dragging noise coming from just beyond the edge of the clearing. My heart rate picked up. I had always known that wild animals were out there, but this sounded different. Closer, heavy, deliberate. I sat up slowly, listening. My fire had dimmed to a low glow. The sound was too steady to be a small animal. It was big. I felt a chill run through me. I grabbed my flashlight, shone it toward the sound, and froze. Just beyond the trees, I could see a large shape moving slowly. My mind raced. A bear? A mountain lion? Neither had ever attacked a human in this forest recently, but I knew it was possible. I stayed very still, making myself small, silent. The shape didn't come closer immediately. I noticed that it moved carefully, almost like it was watching, waiting. I stayed put, my flashlight barely moving, my breath shallow. Time stretched. The noise stopped for a moment, then started again, closer this time. My first instinct was to grab my emergency whistle and make noise, but I remembered the advice I had read. Do not panic, do not make sudden movements, try to make yourself appear small but not weak. I stayed crouched in my tent, flashlight off. The dragging noise continued around the perimeter of the clearing, circling me. My mind ran through every scenario I could imagine, every technique I had read about to survive an animal encounter. But nothing felt adequate. Hours passed, though I couldn't be certain of the time. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows across the clearing. The shape moved back and forth, but never entered the open where my fire was. At dawn, I dared to peek outside. The clearing was empty. No large footprints, no broken branches, nothing to confirm what had been there. I packed cautiously, keeping a mental note to move to a different location further away from where the noise had been. My hands shook as I loaded my backpack. The night had left me drained, terrified, and alert in a way I had never experienced. I hiked cautiously, keeping to the streams and avoiding dense underbrush where something could hide. Every sound made me flinch. I ate little, drank carefully, and moved slowly. I found a new spot in a smaller clearing, surrounded by dense shrubs that offered protection but also restricted visibility. I set up camp again, more careful this time. I made a small perimeter of rocks around the fire, stocked up on larger pieces of wood, and kept a hatchet nearby. I stayed awake much of the night, listening, watching, ready to react. The following day was tense but uneventful. I explored nearby streams, keeping low and making careful notes of my surroundings. I found signs of animals, deer tracks, raccoon prints, small scat, but nothing that suggested large predators. Still, I didn't let my guard down. At night, I slept in short bursts, keeping one ear always alert to movement. I learned to rely not just on sight but on sound, smell, and intuition. On the third night, I awoke to the sound of snapping branches again. This time, I was ready. I stayed completely still, listening. The noise was different, lighter steps, more cautious. It moved around the edge of the clearing again, but closer. My heart thumped, and I gripped the hatchet tightly. Then I heard another sound, a low growl, almost muffled. I realized it was probably a bear, a big one. I had read about bear encounters, and I knew my best chance was to make noise to scare it off or stay calm until it left. I did neither at first. I stayed still, letting the bear's curiosity fade. Hours passed. The growls faded. The dragging noise stopped. By dawn, the clearing was quiet. I checked the area carefully. There were large prints this time, heavy claws pressed into the earth, circling where I had slept. My blood ran cold. I packed quickly, keeping my movements smooth and deliberate. I decided I would hike out as fast as possible, abandoning my planned extended stay. The hike back was exhausting. I moved as silently as I could, sticking to open paths and avoiding dense forest. The sounds of the wilderness were no longer comforting. They were warnings. I kept my backpack light, only essentials and my hatchet ready. I could feel eyes watching me constantly, though I couldn't see anything. After hours of careful hiking, I finally reached a dirt road I recognized from my map. Relief washed over me. I stayed alert until I reached my car, where civilization, lights, and safety felt like a shield I hadn't realized I missed so much. I never went back to that forest. I told no one exactly what had happened, because it sounded unbelievable. I knew the bear, or whatever large animal it had been just as cautious as I was, curious but cautious, testing its boundaries. That experience stayed with me, a reminder of how small and fragile humans are in the wild. I survived because I respected nature, because I stayed calm, and because I observed and reacted carefully. It was terrifying, exhausting, and humbling, but I came out alive. I was careful, alert, and disciplined, and that is why I had a clear ending. I survived without a scratch, but I carried that night with me forever. It started like any other weekend camping trip. I had planned it for weeks, wanting a break from the constant pressure of work and city life. I packed my backpack carefully. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, water, a first aid kit, flashlight, spare batteries, a small hatchet, and some extra clothes. I also carried a map of the area, although I thought I knew the forest trails well enough. The thought of spending a couple of nights alone in the wilderness felt refreshing, almost therapeutic. I left early in the morning, the sky pale and gray with soft sunlight filtering through clouds. The drive to the trailhead was quiet, with the hum of the tires on asphalt and the occasional song on the radio. When I arrived, the air was instantly cleaner, crisper, carrying the subtle smell of pine and damp soil. I parked my car and unloaded my gear, the forest rising ahead of me like a massive wall of green. I could feel the tension from city life starting to melt, replaced by a nervous excitement. The hike to my intended campsite took longer than I expected. The trail was steep and narrow in some areas, covered with wet leaves and loose dirt that made every step uncertain. Occasionally, I had to duck under low branches or step over exposed roots. I paused every now and then to catch my breath, drink some water, and take in the quiet around me. Birds called intermittently, and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush reminded me I was not entirely alone. By late afternoon, I found a spot that seemed perfect. It was a small clearing, surrounded by thick trees on three sides, with a little stream flowing nearby. The ground was mostly flat, a mix of soft dirt and pine needles. I could see enough sky to let the morning sun in, but the surrounding trees would give me cover from wind and rain. I unpacked my tent and began setting it up. The fabric of the tent felt rough and stiff in my hands, but I managed to pitch it carefully, making sure the pegs were deep and secure. I spread my sleeping bag inside, arranged my small stove and supplies, and sat for a moment, looking at the forest around me. As evening approached, I gathered some wood for a fire. The forest floor was damp, and dry wood was scarce. I walked a few hundred feet from my campsite, looking for pieces that weren't too rotten. I found some larger logs for the fire later, and some smaller twigs and branches that would help get it started. When I returned, I built a small ring of stones to contain the fire and began working on the kindling. My hands were clumsy, fumbling at first, but eventually, sparks caught and a small flame grew. The fire crackled and hissed as the moisture in the wood evaporated. It was mesmerizing, hypnotic almost, and I found myself staring into it longer than I expected. The first night was quiet, almost painfully so. The occasional hoot of an owl or rustle of a squirrel reminded me I wasn't alone, but the sounds were distant and harmless. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the wind brushing against the trees, feeling the cold seep into my fingers and toes. My flashlight sat beside me, batteries full, my hatchet within reach. I slept fitfully, waking up several times to check the fire and hear the faint noises outside. Each time, I reassured myself that the forest was normal, that all the noises were ordinary animals going about their lives. The next morning, I woke early, the sun breaking through the trees in pale shafts of light. I made a simple breakfast, oatmeal and coffee, and took the time to wash my face with water from the stream. The air was fresh, scented with pine and wet earth, and I felt a strange kind of calm. I decided to explore the surrounding area, following a narrow path that led deeper into the forest. The path was uneven, sometimes overgrown, and at points it disappeared altogether, forcing me to push through branches and brush. My heart rate increased with each step, partly from the effort and partly from the awareness that being alone in the woods meant danger was always close if I wasn't careful. By midday, I reached a section of the forest that looked untouched, dense and shadowy. Sunlight barely penetrated the thick canopy, and the air was cooler here. I walked slowly, alert, listening for any signs of wildlife. Then I heard it, a low, continuous crunch of twigs behind me. At first I froze, thinking it might be a deer or some other animal. But the sound didn't move like an animal. It moved deliberately, in steps that were uneven but purposeful. I stopped walking, holding my breath, listening. The sound paused when I paused, and when I moved again, it moved too. Panic didn't hit immediately. I rationalized that it was probably another hiker, but the forest here was isolated, and I hadn't seen anyone all morning. My pace quickened slightly, and so did the crunching behind me. My mind raced through worst-case scenarios. If it was a person, I had my hatchet and my fire. But I also knew that, in an open confrontation, weapons didn't guarantee safety. The safest option was to move to a more open area, somewhere I could see clearly, and where help could reach me if needed. I turned down another path that led back toward my campsite, trying to appear calm, to mask my fear. The steps behind me continued, sometimes falling silent for a few seconds, then resuming. I forced myself to breathe steadily, counting in my mind to keep control. The thought of running occurred, but running in uneven forest terrain could lead to a sprained ankle or worse. I forced myself to walk steadily, faster than a normal pace, but cautious. Eventually, I reached a bend in the trail where I could see the open area near the stream. Relief hit me briefly, but it was short-lived. I saw a figure standing partially behind a tree, watching. My heart dropped. It was a man, tall, wearing dark clothes, blending into the shadows. He didn't move, just watched. I froze for a second, then kept walking slowly, pretending not to notice. My hand brushed against the handle of my hatchet in my pack. He didn't move, didn't signal, didn't call, just watched. When I reached a spot where the trees thinned, I broke into a slow jog. I didn't dare run at full speed, but I needed to put distance between myself and him. He stepped forward, but instead of chasing me, he retreated into the shadows of the forest. I kept moving until I reached the clearing of my campsite. My heart was pounding, sweat running down my face despite the cool air. I quickly set up an improvised alarm system. I tied some twine between trees with cans hanging from it near the perimeter of the campsite. Any movement would make noise. I also positioned my fire near the tent entrance for visibility. Night fell again. I stayed awake longer this time, poking the fire occasionally, eating a small snack and listening. The forest was quiet, too quiet. Occasionally, a twig snapped somewhere in the darkness, and I flinched, waiting to hear footsteps follow. But none came. I checked my supplies, my knife, hatchet, flashlight, and phone, though the signal was weak. I couldn't call for help unless I reached the edge of the forest. I realized then that being isolated meant relying entirely on myself, and that realization made my heart pound even harder. The next day, I decided to leave. I packed my tent, carefully gathering all gear, making sure nothing was left behind. I walked briskly, sticking to the main trail, keeping my ears open. The forest seemed normal in the daylight, but I couldn't shake the memory of the figure from last night. Every shadow seemed to shift unnaturally, every rustle in the underbrush making me jump. I forced myself to focus on the trail one step at a time. As I neared the trailhead, I saw my car. Relief washed over me like a wave. I didn't relax completely until I was inside, doors locked, engine running. I stayed there a few minutes, just breathing, letting the safety of the car sink in. I thought about what had happened. The forest had been normal in every way, yet the presence of another person had turned it into something threatening. I realized how easily a situation could have escalated, how vulnerable one could be when alone. Driving away, I noticed the way the sunlight hit the trees differently, the way the shadows moved across the road. I didn't stop to look back. The experience stayed with me, a vivid memory of fear and survival, but also of the caution and awareness that had kept me safe. I knew I would go camping again, but I would never be the same. The forest was beautiful and quiet, but it demanded respect and vigilance. That trip had taught me the importance of preparation, observation, and trusting instincts. Back at home, I unpacked my gear, checked each item, cleaned everything, and stored it carefully. I documented the experience in my journal, not as a story for anyone else, but as a record of lessons learned. The fear had faded, but the awareness remained. I had survived an encounter that could have gone badly, and I knew now how much attention, care, and calm were required in the wilderness. Even weeks later, the memory would creep into my mind sometimes. Walking alone through dense forest, hearing footsteps not my own, feeling eyes on me in the shadows. But now, instead of panic, I remembered the control I had maintained, the careful steps, the mental strategies that had kept me alive. That clarity and preparation had made the difference. And for the first time, I could appreciate the wilderness fully. Beautiful, serene, and yet always demanding respect. I knew the forest could be dangerous, but I also knew I could handle it, as long as I stayed alert, careful, and prepared. I had always loved camping, the way the air smelled fresher, the sounds of the forest filling your ears, and the sense of freedom that came from being away from the world. I had been planning this trip for months, a solo trek into a remote section of the national forest, far from marked trails and popular campsites. I wanted isolation, a chance to push myself and test my own limits. What I didn't realize was how close the experience would bring me to fear I had never known. I arrived at the trailhead in the early morning, the sun barely creeping over the distant hills, painting the sky in muted shades of pink and gray. My backpack was heavy, stuffed with food, water, a small first aid kit, a sleeping bag, a tent, and the essentials any experienced camper would carry. I double-checked everything, making sure my maps and compass were within reach. I wanted to make sure I wouldn't get lost, but I also wanted to venture far enough to avoid anyone else. I wanted silence, solitude, and a chance to be completely alone with the wilderness. The first few hours of hiking were everything I had hoped for. The forest was alive with birdsong, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, and the occasional distant cry of a hawk. Sunlight filtered through the trees in scattered beams, casting shifting shadows across the forest floor. I moved steadily, keeping a careful eye on the trail markers, stopping occasionally to sip water and eat some trail mix. By midday, I reached a small clearing near a creek. The water was clear, cold, and inviting. I knelt beside it to drink and refill my bottle, enjoying the solitude and the quiet murmur of the water. As I continued further into the forest, the trail became less distinct, almost vanishing entirely at points. The trees grew denser, and the underbrush thicker, forcing me to navigate carefully. I relied heavily on my compass and landmarks I had noted on the map. By late afternoon, I had reached the area I had planned to camp in, a small plateau with a flat area of ground perfect for a tent. The plateau overlooked a narrow valley, the trees below creating a patchwork of dark greens and browns. I set up my tent carefully, securing the stakes firmly into the earth, and arranged my gear inside. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the clearing. After setting up camp, I gathered some dry wood for a fire. The smell of pine filled the air as I worked, and the soft crackle of the fire soon replaced the sounds of the forest. I cooked a small meal, eating slowly and savoring the warmth of the flames. As darkness fell, the forest transformed. The shadows deepened, and every rustle of leaves or crack of a branch became amplified in the quiet. I could feel my pulse quicken with every unfamiliar sound, a reminder of how completely alone I was. Around 10 o'clock, I crawled into my sleeping bag, hoping to get some rest. The fire had burned low, but a few embers still glowed, casting flickering light across the tent walls. I was exhausted but found sleep elusive. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined strange shapes moving just beyond the edge of the clearing. I tried to calm myself, reminding myself that the forest was full of wildlife and nothing more. Then I heard it. At first, I thought it was a branch breaking in the distance, but the sound repeated, deliberate and closer than I expected. It was the unmistakable crack of a heavy stick under weight. My stomach dropped. My mind raced. I had been careful to keep my campsite clean, my food packed away. Bears were possible, though unlikely given the season, but the forest was home to other predators too. Coyotes, maybe a bobcat, but the sound was too heavy, too human in cadence, to belong to a wild animal. I stayed perfectly still, straining to listen. The sound came again, closer this time. Someone or something was moving through the underbrush near my camp. My heart pounded. I wasn't carrying a firearm. I had only a small folding knife. I considered making noise, shouting, but the thought of alerting them to my exact location froze me in place. I quietly zipped the tent partially closed, leaving just enough ventilation, and listened. The noise didn't stop. Twigs snapped as something or someone approached the edge of my clearing. My mind raced through possible explanations. Hikers, poachers, homeless people living in the forest. I had no way of knowing. The forest was vast, and being completely alone meant there was no help within miles. The rational part of me urged calm. The survival instinct screamed to get out. Hours seemed to pass with me crouched inside my tent, barely breathing. The sounds of movement came and went, circling the clearing, sometimes near, sometimes farther away. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow pass near the edge of the tent. I didn't move, didn't react, just waited. I could feel sweat running down my back, cold despite the fire embers that still glowed. Dawn seemed impossibly far away. Finally, as the first hints of light touched the sky, the noises ceased. The forest felt empty again, though every snap of a branch and rustle of leaves kept me on edge. I waited until full daylight, cautious but desperate to escape. I packed my tent slowly, keeping my knife ready, and made my way down the plateau toward the nearest main trail. My eyes scanned constantly for movement. Every shadow could be someone following me, every shape a potential threat. By mid-morning, I reached a clearer trail, one I could follow confidently back to the trailhead. I walked quickly but cautiously, constantly listening. At one point, I heard voices, distant and muffled. Relief washed over me. I was no longer completely alone. Within another hour, I emerged from the dense forest onto a familiar path that led directly to the trailhead. A couple of hikers passed by, waving and smiling. I nodded, almost unable to speak, still shaking from the previous night. Back at my car, I collapsed into the seat, exhausted, drained, and grateful. I drove home slowly, replaying the events over and over in my mind. The fear had been real, grounded in reality, but the fact that I had survived made it a story I would never forget. The forest was beautiful, serene, and alive, but it was also unpredictable, and the memory of being completely alone, hearing footsteps circling my tent in the dark, would stay with me forever. In the days that followed, I researched the area more carefully, learning about local wildlife, the potential for human trespassers, and safety precautions for solo campers. I understood that I had been lucky, that a combination of caution, preparation, and instinct had kept me safe. I returned to camping eventually, but never without more care, awareness, and respect for the unpredictability of the wild. The forest could be peaceful and renewing, but it could also remind you, in the quietest and scariest ways, that you were just a visitor in someone else's domain. I never discovered exactly what had been near my tent that night. The tracks I found the next morning were too faint to identify, fading quickly into the forest floor. But the memory of the fear, the adrenaline, the silence, and the heavy footsteps circling my camp became a permanent part of my experience. I survived, and I returned with greater knowledge, skill, and respect for the forest. That clarity, that survival was my ending messy, realistic, and entirely my own. I had been planning this camping trip for months. I had always liked being alone in nature, away from the noise of the city, away from the constant hum of people and traffic. I wanted to disconnect, to feel the rawness of the wilderness and the peace that comes with isolation. I packed my gear carefully, making sure I had enough food, water, a sturdy tent, sleeping bag, first aid supplies, and a portable stove. I double-checked everything, because I had learned from past experiences that a small mistake in preparation could become a nightmare in the wild. The morning I left, the air was crisp, the kind of cold that wakes you up before your alarm does. I drove for hours, leaving behind the paved roads and towns, heading deeper into the forest. The further I went, the more the landscape changed. Tall trees stretched into the sky, their leaves forming a dense canopy that filtered the sunlight. The roads narrowed, turning into dirt paths that shook the car as I drove. Eventually, the path became more of a trail than a road, and I parked at a small clearing. The spot looked promising, remote enough to feel alone, yet not so wild that I felt unsafe. I carried my gear down a narrow trail, my boots crunching on fallen leaves and twigs. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, the kind of smell that makes your lungs feel clean with each breath. I found a small clearing that seemed ideal for setting up camp. There was a stream nearby, its water sparkling in the afternoon sun. The sound of it was soothing, a gentle rush that promised water for cooking and drinking if I filtered it. I chose the spot carefully, avoiding low areas that might flood in rain, and making sure the ground was level enough for my tent. Setting up camp took longer than I expected. I hammered the tent stakes into the ground, making sure the tent was taut and secure. I organized my supplies, keeping my food stored away in a waterproof bag to avoid attracting animals. I started a small fire in a cleared area, the flames crackling and sending warmth into the chilly air. I prepared a simple meal, something I could cook over the fire without fuss. As I ate, I watched the sunlight fade through the trees, painting the forest in shades of gold and red. Night came faster than I anticipated. The forest seemed to change when the light disappeared. Shadows deepened, stretching and twisting in the firelight. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sounded louder, sharper, closer. I told myself it was just the wind, or small animals moving through the underbrush, but a tight knot of unease settled in my stomach. I decided to get my fire going higher before crawling into the tent. The warmth of the flames reassured me, the soft light pushing back the darkness just enough to make me feel safer. I fell asleep listening to the stream, my body comforted by the rhythmic sound. But sleep was restless. I kept waking at odd intervals, my mind alert to the smallest noises. Around midnight, I awoke to a sound that immediately put me on edge. It wasn't the usual rustling of small animals or the wind through the trees. This was heavier, slower, deliberate. Footsteps. Someone or something was walking near my camp. My heart raced. I stayed still, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped, then resumed in a different direction, circling. My mind ran through scenarios, trying to convince myself it was just a deer or a bear. But the pattern was too purposeful, too human. I stayed in my tent, quiet as I could be, listening. Every crack of a branch, every shift of the leaves, made my stomach tighten. I thought about leaving, about running through the dark forest to the car, but I was afraid I wouldn't make it without being seen. I also knew moving in the dark could be dangerous, risking falls or injuries. So I stayed, listening, trying to steady my breathing. The footsteps eventually faded. I forced myself to sleep, though each creak of the tent made me jolt awake. The next morning, I left the tent for a short time to inspect the perimeter. I found footprints, boot prints, circling my camp. They were fresh. Someone had been here during the night, close enough to see me sleeping if they had looked into my tent. A cold realization hit me. I was not alone. The forest I thought would be a sanctuary could be a trap. I packed some of my belongings carefully, making sure I had essentials ready. I didn't want to leave yet, but I needed to be cautious. I decided to explore further down the trail, away from the immediate clearing. I kept my backpack on and my knife within easy reach. Every sound made me flinch. Birds that had been quiet during the day chirped nervously, and even the wind seemed louder now, carrying sounds from further away. I kept reminding myself that the forest is full of other humans too, hikers, hunters, but that knowledge did little to calm me. Hours later, I stumbled upon another sign that someone had been near my camp. A small fire pit, not far from where I had been, with charred wood still warm enough that it had not been long extinguished. Nearby, a plastic bottle with some scraps of food inside. My stomach turned. Whoever had been near my camp was not far, and they had been prepared to linger. I realized I couldn't stay in one place for long. I needed to create distance, but I also couldn't risk getting lost. I chose a route along the stream, thinking it might help guide me. The ground was uneven, muddy in places, and my boots sank into the soft earth. I stayed alert, constantly scanning the forest. Shadows moved just beyond my sight, and every sound made me tense. I reminded myself of the basics of survival. Stay aware, don't panic, ration water and food, and keep moving if necessary. I made small marks on trees to track my path, but I knew they could be noticed by someone following. By late afternoon, exhaustion hit me. I hadn't slept well, my body drained from tension and lack of proper rest. I found another small clearing to rest and eat something light. I kept my knife close and my fire ready. The thought that someone might be nearby never left me. I slept lightly, waking frequently to check the surroundings. The night after that was the hardest. I heard movement again, closer this time. Someone walking softly, deliberately, making minimal noise. I stayed absolutely still, barely breathing, until the sounds faded. Sleep was almost impossible. By dawn, I was exhausted, my body aching, my mind on high alert. I decided then that I needed to leave the forest entirely. Staying longer was too risky. I followed the stream, hoping it would lead to a larger trail or a road. I moved cautiously, avoiding open areas where I might be spotted. Every step was calculated. I rationed water carefully, using my filter sparingly. Hunger and fatigue made the forest feel heavier, each tree larger, each shadow darker. But I kept going, driven by the need to escape the unseen presence I felt around me. After hours of careful movement, I heard the distant sound of a vehicle. My heart leapt. I followed the sound, navigating the undergrowth, stepping over fallen branches and rocks. The forest was dense, and at times I had to crawl through tight spaces, my clothes snagging on branches. Finally, the sound grew louder, clearer. I emerged from the trees onto a gravel road. Car appeared in the distance. I waved frantically, my relief palpable. The vehicle slowed, and a driver stopped. I explained briefly that I had been camping alone and had gotten lost, and they offered me a ride to the nearest town. The sense of safety returned gradually, but I stayed alert even in the car. The driver noticed my tension, but I couldn't bring myself to explain fully why. Back in town, I found a small motel and rested properly. I slept deeply for the first time in days. Over the next few days, I reported the footprints and the fire pit to local authorities. They explained that the area had occasional reports of people trespassing in remote campsites, sometimes with ill intentions, sometimes just curious or careless. I realized that my fear had been entirely justified. I had been in a remote area, exposed, and someone else had been nearby without my knowledge. The forest hadn't been hostile itself, but human presence made it dangerous. Eventually, I returned home, tired but safe. The experience stayed with me. I thought a lot about preparation, awareness, and the thin line between enjoying solitude and being exposed to real danger. I continued to camp, but I became more cautious. I chose sites that were more trafficked, informed someone of my exact location, and carried extra safety equipment. I learned that nature itself isn't scary. It's the unpredictability of human behavior in the wilderness that can turn a peaceful camping trip into a terrifying ordeal. Looking back, I understood the fear I had felt, the way my senses had heightened, how my body had reacted to the unknown presence. I realized that preparation and awareness are more important than bravado or solitude. That trip, frightening as it was, taught me respect for the forest, for other people, and for the fragile safety that exists when you are completely alone in the wild. I was lucky to leave unharmed, and I never forgot the lesson. Even the quietest, most peaceful forest can hold danger, and survival depends on vigilance, planning, and quick thinking. From that point on, every camping trip I took was approached with the knowledge that danger isn't always obvious, and being alone can be both beautiful and terrifying. I learned to enjoy the wilderness again, but with a sharper awareness, a deeper respect for its unpredictability, and an understanding that sometimes the most frightening part of nature isn't the forest itself. It's what other humans might be doing within it. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks. The plan was simple. Spend 4 days alone in the woods, far from roads, far from people. Just me, my backpack, and the sound of nature. I had been camping before, but nothing like this. I wanted the isolation, the quiet, and the chance to test myself in the wild. I packed carefully, double-checking my gear. A tent, sleeping bag, stove, water filter, food for 4 days, a first aid kit, my compass, and my map. I also carried a hunting knife and a small, old revolver I had inherited from my grandfather, more for peace of mind than anything else. I drove early in the morning to a trailhead deep in the forest, leaving my car in a small, empty parking lot. The sky was gray but clear, the kind of day where the sun is behind clouds, soft and cold. I started hiking with a brisk pace, following a trail marked on the map. The forest was dense, tall pines and oaks stretching up, the ground covered with pine needles, leaves, and fallen branches. Every step I took made a crisp, crackling sound, and the air smelled like wet earth and pine sap. The first day passed without incident. I found a clearing by a small stream in the afternoon, a perfect place to set up camp. I pitched my tent, collected firewood, and filtered water from the stream. I made a simple dinner of canned beans and rice, heating it on my small stove. The sun was setting, and the forest started to darken, shadows stretching long across the ground. I sat on a rock by my campfire, watching the smoke rise, feeling a sense of calm. I felt completely alone, yet strangely comfortable. That night, I slept lightly. Every sound seemed louder in the forest at night. The rustle of leaves, the snapping of twigs, the occasional hoot of an owl. I woke at one point to the sound of something moving outside my tent. I froze, holding my breath, listening. It was probably a deer, I told myself, or maybe a raccoon. I peeked through the small mesh window and saw nothing. After a long while, the forest fell silent again, and I finally drifted back to sleep. The second day, I decided to explore further. I followed a trail that led uphill, deeper into the forest, away from the stream. The terrain became rougher, rocks, roots, and thick underbrush. The air grew colder as I climbed. I noticed tracks on the ground, deep and wide, probably from a large animal. At first, I thought they were deer tracks, but the spacing was wrong. I paused, studying them carefully. They were fresh. My stomach tightened, and a cold knot formed there. The tracks were too large for a deer, maybe a bear. I knew the area had bears, and I had read all the warnings. I slowed my pace and stayed alert, constantly scanning the trees. I carried my knife in one hand, the revolver in the other, though I hoped I wouldn't need it. The tracks led off the trail and into thicker forest. I debated whether to follow them or turn back. Curiosity got the better of me, but I stayed cautious. I moved quietly, stepping lightly over roots and leaves. Every snap of a twig underfoot made me jump, my heart racing. Then I saw it. A large black bear, not far from the trail. It hadn't noticed me yet. Its fur was glossy, its head low to the ground as it sniffed and foraged. I froze, trying not to breathe too loudly. The bear was enormous, easily 7 or 8 feet, standing on its hind legs, massive shoulders, and claws that could shred a tree. I remembered everything I had read about bear encounters. Don't run, make yourself look bigger, slowly back away. I stayed still for what felt like minutes, though it could have been seconds. Then, slowly, I backed up, keeping my eyes on it. It noticed me, its head lifted, ears twitching, nostrils flaring. For a moment, it just stared. My stomach dropped. Then it let out a low growl and started walking toward me. Panic surged. I raised my arms, shouted, tried to make myself appear bigger. I slowly retreated, heart hammering. But the bear was closing the distance faster than I anticipated. My mind raced. I remembered reading about bear spray, but I didn't have any. Only the knife and the revolver, and I knew neither would help if it attacked me. I tripped over a root and fell, hitting my shoulder hard. Pain shot through my arm. The bear was just 20 feet away now. I scrambled backward, grabbing a thick branch as I tried to defend myself. The bear roared, a sound that shook me to the core. Charged. I threw the branch, but it barely reacted. My instinct screamed, "Run." I turned and bolted downhill, sliding and tumbling over rocks and roots. My legs burned, lungs screaming for air. The bear roared again, but after what felt like an eternity, I reached the trail, the open space of the stream clearing. I didn't stop. I ran as fast as my legs could carry me, adrenaline giving me strength I didn't know I had. I crashed through bushes, stumbled over logs, and finally made it back to my campsite. My tent was still there, untouched. I collapsed inside, shaking, unable to speak or even think clearly. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. I checked my map and compass, trying to calm down, trying to figure out where I was. I realized the bear must have followed the trail to the area where I had first encountered it, but then decided I wasn't worth the trouble. That night, I slept with one eye open, the revolver next to me, my knife within reach. I didn't hear the bear again, but I couldn't shake the fear. Every noise made me jump. The next day, I decided not to explore. I stayed close to the clearing, watching the trees, listening. I gathered more firewood, filtered more water, and ate cautiously, always keeping my knife close. I tried to focus on the beauty of the forest, the sunlight filtering through the branches, the sound of the stream, the smell of the pine, but my mind kept drifting back to the bear. The third day, I decided it was time to leave. I packed everything carefully, making sure I had all my gear. I took one last look at the stream, the clearing, the place I had spent the past few days. The forest was quiet, almost peaceful, but I felt a lingering tension, a reminder of how close I had come to danger. I followed the trail back the way I had come, keeping my eyes and ears open. I moved slowly, deliberately, remembering every step, every sound. As I walked, I saw more tracks, the same bear, moving in the direction I had come from. I slowed even more, staying alert. I kept my distance, letting the bear have the right of way, avoiding any sudden movements. Hours passed, and finally, I reached the parking lot where I had left my car. Relief washed over me. I locked the car, sitting inside for a few minutes, trying to calm down and process everything that had happened. The drive back was quiet. I kept the windows up, listening to the hum of the engine, thinking about the forest, the bear, and how fragile human safety can be in the wild. I realized that I had been lucky, that my preparation, caution, and quick thinking had saved me. I had tested myself, and I had survived. Once home, I cleaned my gear carefully, thinking about the trip. I didn't feel shame or fear anymore. I felt respect for the forest, for the animals, and for the fact that nature doesn't care about humans. It had been a terrifying experience, one that had pushed me to the edge, but I had come back safely. I knew I would return to the forest someday, but with more experience, more preparation, and a deeper understanding of the dangers. The camping trip had been scary, exhausting, and intense. I had faced real danger, something that could have ended my life if I had made a single mistake. But I had learned, I had survived, and I had gained a story that would stay with me forever. Every detail, every sound, every moment of fear had been real, and I had made it through. I had respected the forest, respected the animal, and respected myself. And in that, there was a kind of triumph, a clear and lasting sense of accomplishment. I unpacked my gear, hung up my clothes to dry, and slowly settled back into normal life, carrying the memory of the forest with me. I never forgot how it felt to run through the woods with a bear behind me, the terror and the adrenaline, and the relief when I finally reached safety. The forest had tested me, but I had emerged stronger, wiser, and with a renewed respect for the wild. That trip had been scary, but it ended clearly, safely, and with a lesson I would never forget. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months, saving up the time and money to escape the city for a full week in the wilderness. The idea of spending nights under the stars, far from roads, cars, or people sounded freeing. I had been on hikes before, overnight treks with friends, but this time I wanted the challenge of being completely alone. I had read about the area I was going to, a remote stretch of forest in the mountains, known for its rugged trails, streams, and isolated campsites. The maps showed nothing but trees and a few narrow trails. No roads, no cabins, nothing. It seemed perfect. I packed carefully. My pack was heavy, probably over 40 pounds, with all the essentials. A tent, sleeping bag, portable stove, water filter, food for a week, first aid kit, knife, flashlight with extra batteries, rope, and even a small emergency blanket. I had packed some extra clothes in case the weather changed, because the forecast said clear skies, but mountain weather was unpredictable. I also carried a whistle and a small flare in case something went wrong. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going, just that I'd be in the mountains, because I knew friends or family would worry too much. The drive to the trailhead was long. The road narrowed as I got closer, the pavement disappearing and turning into packed dirt, winding through dense pine forests. By the time I parked, I was alone, with nothing around me except the trees, the distant sound of a river, and the faint scent of pine needles and wet earth. It was early morning, the sun just beginning to touch the tops of the trees. The first few hours of hiking were easy, following a trail that was surprisingly well marked with painted blazes on the trees. I kept a steady pace, occasionally stopping to drink water or adjust my pack. The trail was narrow in places, bordered by ferns, moss, and thick undergrowth. The sunlight filtered through the canopy in thin shafts, making the forest floor glow in spots. Birds chirped, and the occasional rustle of small animals could be heard in the distance. Everything felt normal, almost idyllic, the way I had imagined. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing by a small creek, the kind of place I imagined setting up camp. It was beautiful, with flat ground, soft grass, and stones for a fire pit. I put down my pack and started to gather firewood, choosing pieces that were dry and straight, making a neat stack nearby. Setting up the tent took longer than I expected. The wind was picking up slightly, and the ground was uneven in places, but I managed. I made sure it was secure, pegged down properly, and tested the zipper to make sure it closed completely. I set my sleeping bag inside, unrolled my pad, and arranged my things so that the tent felt like a safe little space. I started a fire as the sun dipped lower, the orange glow of the flames flickering on the trees. I cooked a simple meal of rice and beans on the portable stove, eating quietly, the sound of the creek nearby filling the silence. It was peaceful, but I felt the first stirrings of unease, a subtle awareness of being completely alone in a vast, wild place. The forest seemed to grow denser around me as night approached. As darkness fell, the noises of the forest changed. The birds were gone, replaced by the croaks of frogs and the occasional rustle of leaves. I could hear small animals moving in the underbrush, their movements cautious and deliberate. I thought I heard something heavier moving in the distance, but the darkness made it impossible to see. I checked my supplies, made sure my knife was within reach, and decided to get some sleep. The tent felt tight but protective, a barrier between me and the unknown outside. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke. I couldn't remember exactly why at first, but there was a feeling in my chest, a tension that made my muscles tight. Then I heard it, a low, crunching sound on the ground outside the tent. At first, I thought it might be a deer or maybe a raccoon. But then the steps continued, careful, deliberate, circling the tent. My heart started to pound, and I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was probably just a wild animal. I didn't want to make noise, so I stayed perfectly still, holding my breath and listening. The sound stopped. Then there was silence, deep and thick, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I waited for what felt like forever. The fire I had built now reduced to glowing embers. Finally, I convinced myself it was nothing and tried to go back to sleep, though I stayed alert, every sense on edge. Morning came slowly. I forced myself out of the tent, brushing off the tension of the night. The clearing looked the same, the forest peaceful in daylight, with the creek sparkling in the sun. I ate breakfast, packed my food securely, and made sure no traces of my campsite were left that could attract animals. Still, there was a nagging feeling of being watched, a tension I couldn't shake. I decided to explore deeper into the forest, following a narrow trail along the creek. The terrain became more rugged, roots and rocks making each step careful and deliberate. I tried to enjoy the hike, but every sound, birdsong, leaves rustling, twigs snapping, made me tense. The deeper I went, the narrower the trail became, until it disappeared entirely in places, forcing me to navigate by instinct and memory. Around mid-afternoon, I came across a slope leading down to the creek. The water was clear, fast, and cold, and I knelt to drink directly from it, using my hands as a cup. As I looked up, I noticed a set of footprints on the muddy bank, human footprints. My stomach sank. They were fresh, and they didn't appear to be from anyone I had seen before. They were heading upstream in the same direction I was going. My heart rate picked up, and I debated whether to follow the trail or return to my campsite. I decided to be cautious and circle back. Retracing my steps was harder than I anticipated. The forest was denser than it seemed from the trailhead, and the sunlight was fading quickly. By the time I reached my campsite, the fire pit was cold, and I was exhausted. I decided to stay in the tent for the night, this time keeping my knife within reach, the whistle on my chest, and my pack positioned so I could grab it quickly if I had to leave. That night, the footsteps returned. Louder, closer, and more deliberate. They circled the tent, paused, then moved away, only to return after a few minutes. Sleep was impossible. I stayed awake, holding my breath each time a branch snapped. Around midnight, I heard a low growl, not like a dog, not like anything I recognized. I realized it wasn't an animal. It was a human sound, deep and threatening, but not angry, intentional, careful. I knew I had to leave. I waited until the noise faded slightly, then carefully unzipped the tent, keeping low to avoid being seen. I grabbed my pack, knife, and whistle, and began walking quietly toward the main trail. Every step made my heart jump. The forest felt alive, aware of me. I stayed near the creek for cover, using the shadows and the uneven terrain to mask my movements. I walked for hours, carefully navigating the terrain, staying alert. I heard footsteps occasionally behind me but kept moving, avoiding open areas, sticking to cover. Dawn was approaching when I finally reached a wider trail that led toward the parking area. Relief washed over me, but I kept walking cautiously, knowing danger could still be near. By mid-morning, I emerged from the forest near the road where I had parked. My legs were sore, my body exhausted, and I was trembling. I took a deep breath, listening to the distant hum of cars, a sound I hadn't realized I missed. I returned to my car, loaded my gear, and drove away slowly, constantly checking the rearview mirror. The experience stayed with me for months. I realized that the wilderness, while beautiful, could be unpredictable in ways I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't about ghosts or fairy tales. It was the real danger of being completely isolated, of encountering someone who shouldn't be there, someone who could see me as a threat or an opportunity. I learned to respect the forest in a new way, not just for its beauty, but for its capacity to conceal danger, for how small and exposed you could feel in a place without roads, without people. I never returned to that exact spot, but I started camping again more cautiously. I learned to inform friends about my exact location, carry better protection, and trust my instincts when something felt wrong. I realized the forest itself isn't inherently dangerous, but the isolation amplifies the risk posed by other humans. By the end, I felt grateful to have returned safely, wiser, and more prepared, carrying both the memory of that fear and the lessons it taught me. I could now enjoy the outdoors fully, but with respect for its quiet, hidden threats, and the understanding that sometimes the scariest moments are those that are entirely real, entirely human, and entirely preventable if you prepare wisely. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. I knew I needed to get away from the city, from the constant noise, from the endless routines that never seemed to stop. My backpack was heavy, filled with the essentials I thought I'd need. A tent, sleeping bag, food supplies, water, a stove, a first aid kit, a flashlight, batteries, and some extra clothing. I had maps, a compass, and my phone with GPS, though I didn't expect to have any service. I wanted this trip to feel raw and real, to push myself a little further into nature than I had ever gone before. I had chosen a spot deep in a national forest, one that promised isolation, rugged terrain, and beauty. What I didn't realize was just how isolating it could be, or how careful I would have to be. The first day went smoothly. I hiked for hours through thick woods, the trail narrow and uneven. The smell of damp earth and pine needles filled the air, and the sound of the wind through the trees was both soothing and sharp, whispering in ways I didn't recognize. Birds called overhead, and every so often, a rustle in the underbrush reminded me that I wasn't the only one out here. I stopped often, just to look around, to breathe in the quiet, to feel how small I really was in this space. The sun was already low in the sky when I found a clearing near a small stream. The ground was flat enough to pitch my tent, and I set it up slowly, making sure the corners were secure. I made a fire in a safe spot away from dry leaves, just enough to cook my dinner and warm my hands. That night, I felt a sense of satisfaction. Alone, but completely alive, I fell asleep listening to the soft gurgle of the stream and the distant calls of animals. The second day, I explored further. I had brought a small notebook and pen, intending to record my thoughts and the things I saw. The forest became denser, the trees taller, and the path less clear. I marked my trail carefully with small chalk marks and stacked stones to help find my way back. Around midday, I crossed a small ridge, and from there, I could see a low valley with a patch of fog settled over a river. It looked beautiful, almost like a painting. I decided to go down and follow the river, thinking I might find fish or some other wildlife. The descent was slippery. Wet moss and loose stones made each step risky. I moved slowly, carefully, focusing on my footing. The sound of water grew louder as I approached, and I could see the river winding through the forest. I spent hours following it, noticing small signs of animals. Tracks in the mud, broken branches, claw marks on trees. I felt a thrill, a mixture of awe and fear. Out here, everything felt alive and unpredictable. As evening approached, I realized I had wandered further than I had intended. The valley was beautiful, but it was starting to feel isolating. The sun was getting lower, and I needed to find a spot to set up camp. I followed the river for a while longer, looking for flat ground, but it was mostly steep and uneven. Finally, I found a small clearing near a bend in the river, where the ground was relatively flat. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. I pitched my tent, gathered firewood, and made a small fire. I tried to eat, but my appetite was gone. The forest seemed different here. More enclosed, the shadows longer and darker. I kept hearing small noises, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. I kept telling myself it was just the wind, just animals moving, nothing more. But still, I felt a tight knot of unease in my chest. I went to sleep with one eye open, the flashlight within reach, knowing that being alert was important. The third day started with heavy fog. It was so thick that I could barely see 10 feet ahead. I decided to stay put, not wanting to risk getting lost in such low visibility. I spent the day examining the area, collecting firewood, and trying to dry some damp clothes. The fog made everything look different. The familiar landmarks disappeared, replaced by shadows and shapes that shifted as the wind moved the trees. By late afternoon, the fog had begun to lift slightly, and I decided to explore the riverbank, hoping to catch some fish for dinner. That's when I saw the first real sign of danger. There were footprints in the mud, large, deep, and fresh. I froze, staring at them. They weren't mine. They weren't animal prints either. I tried to rationalize. Maybe a hiker had come by. But the location was remote, and it didn't make sense. I scanned the trees, the underbrush, looking for any movement, but I saw nothing. Still, a sense of dread settled over me. I decided not to pursue any further and returned to my tent as quickly as I could, keeping my eyes peeled for anything unusual. That night, sleep was impossible. Every sound seemed amplified. The creak, the wind, the occasional snap of a branch. I lay awake, imagining what might be out there, making mental notes to be more careful. The fourth day, I tried to stick to the trail I had marked, but the forest seemed to conspire against me. A fallen tree had blocked the path, and as I attempted to climb over it, I realized I was disoriented. The marks I had left were hard to see now with shadows and morning fog. I felt a growing panic, realizing that even with my preparations, I could get lost. I retraced my steps, trying to remain calm, reminding myself to think logically. I found a spot that looked vaguely familiar and took a long break, sitting on a rock and drinking water. That's when I heard something moving nearby, not far, not slow. Something was walking through the underbrush. It wasn't a bird or a small animal. It was heavier, deliberate. My first thought was a bear, and my heart pounded. I scanned the trees, listening, trying to gauge the distance. The movement stopped, then started again, circling, coming closer, then retreating. I stayed as still as I could, gripping my walking stick like a weapon. Eventually, it moved away, or so I thought. I didn't move until I heard nothing for a long time. The rest of the day, I stuck near my campsite, making sure I could defend myself if needed. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The fifth day, things escalated. Early in the morning, I went to check the perimeter around my tent. That's when I noticed something alarming. The firewood I had gathered the day before was disturbed. Some logs were moved, scattered as if someone or something had been there. My stomach sank. This wasn't wildlife. Bears don't move logs like that, not without knocking over the whole pile. I started checking for tracks, and sure enough, there were deep impressions in the soft soil near my tent. Large, heavy, human-sized. Someone had been there while I slept. Fear gripped me, sharp and cold. I didn't hear anyone, but the signs were clear. I packed up my essentials immediately. I left the tent and fire behind. I had to get out. I moved cautiously, scanning every shadow, every tree, for movement. The forest that had felt peaceful days before now seemed menacing, alive with invisible eyes. I stuck close to the river, reasoning that it could guide me back to a larger path, maybe to a road. Hours passed, each step tense. Every snap of a branch made me jump. Every rustle made me stop cold. My energy waned, and I realized I couldn't move as fast as I wanted. I had to conserve strength. As dusk approached, I was exhausted. The riverbank narrowed, and I had to navigate a steep incline. My foot slipped, and I landed hard on my side. Pain shot through my ribs, and for a moment, I feared I had broken something. I rested, breathing heavily, pressing myself against a tree for support. That's when I heard it. A low sound, almost a growl, but human. I froze. The tracks, the disturbed firewood, the sounds. It all clicked together. Someone was following me. I didn't know how long. I didn't know how close, but I could feel the presence. Panic surged, but I forced myself to stay quiet. I had to move, had to find safety before darkness fell completely. I started crawling up the incline, using roots and rocks to pull myself along. Pain burned in my limbs, but I kept going, pushing through every instinct to stop. Finally, I reached the top of the incline and saw what looked like a trail, one that could lead out of this valley. I followed it, stumbling and falling, but eventually moving faster as adrenaline pushed me. I didn't dare look back. Night fell completely while I was on the trail. I had only a flashlight to guide me, weak and flickering. My feet were scraped, my ribs ached, and I felt dehydrated. But then I saw a faint glow in the distance. Lights from a ranger station, maybe a road, maybe a campsite with other people. Relief was overwhelming, and I pushed forward despite my exhaustion. I reached the edge of the forest and saw a vehicle parked near a small clearing. I ran toward it, waving my hands frantically. The driver, a local hiker, saw me and helped me inside. I explained briefly, shaking, and they called the authorities. Soon, rangers arrived and searched the forest. They found evidence that someone had been following me, leaving signs to intimidate me, maybe with intent to harm. They reassured me that it was safe now, that the person had been identified through patrols and surveillance in nearby areas. They arranged for me to get medical attention, checking my bruises and minor injuries, and gave me water and food. The fear slowly began to ebb, replaced with exhaustion and relief. Looking back, I realized how unprepared I had been for human threats. Wildlife and weather were one thing, but humans in the wilderness could be unpredictable and dangerous. The experience left me with a mix of respect for nature and a cautious awareness of people's unpredictability. I learned to plan more carefully, to stay aware, to have backup communication options. It changed my approach to camping forever, but it didn't take away my love for it. I still camped, still hiked, but with far more care, always knowing that danger could come in ways I might never anticipate. And that day, that terrifying fifth day, had been a harsh but unforgettable lesson in survival, awareness, and resilience. I had been planning the trip for months. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip in the backcountry. Just me, my pack, and the forest. I wanted isolation, a break from the constant noise of the city, the emails, the calls, the constant pull of obligations. The kind of isolation where the only sounds you hear are your own footsteps and the wind through the trees. I had my map, a compass, a good knife, and a backpack loaded with all the essentials. Food, water, first aid, fire-starting tools, a flashlight with extra batteries, a sturdy tent, and a sleeping bag rated for below freezing. I had checked the weather. It was supposed to be clear, with only a slight chance of rain, nothing too threatening. I told myself I was prepared for anything. The first day was uneventful. The trail was steep in places, but manageable. Birds chirped above me, and the smell of pine filled the air. I passed small creeks and climbed over rocks, the sun warming my back. I noticed deer tracks in the mud but saw no animals. I was careful to mark my path, leaving small, subtle signs to retrace if needed. By late afternoon, I found a clearing beside a small stream. The ground was soft and flat, perfect for a campsite. I unpacked, set up the tent, and started gathering wood for a fire. The first night I slept lightly. Every small sound startled me. The wind rattling the trees, a twig snapping under the weight of some unseen animal, the faint rustle of leaves. I kept my knife nearby, my flashlight within reach, and I listened. The forest was alive with noises, but nothing felt threatening, just unfamiliar. I reminded myself it was normal to feel uneasy in the dark, alone, miles from anyone else. The next day, I decided to explore further. I followed a small path along the ridge of a hill, hoping to find a better view or a new campsite for the following night. The forest grew denser, the trees older and thicker. The path became less defined, more of a suggestion than a trail. Moss covered the ground, and roots twisted across my way, making every step uncertain. At some point, I realized I hadn't seen any other signs of human presence for hours. No footprints, no litter, no faint traces of other campers. Just me and the forest. That isolation, which felt freeing at first, began to feel oppressive. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing with an old, dried-up pond in the center. The ground around it was uneven, and the trees around the edge were knotted and gnarled. The air was still. No birds, no insects. It was strange, almost too quiet. I took off my pack to rest and drink water. That's when I noticed it. The smell. A pungent, almost metallic scent. Faint but unmistakable. My heart began to race and I scanned the area. There was no obvious source. No carcass, no rotting plant matter. Nothing. Still, the smell clung to the air, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I decided not to linger. I turned back toward the main trail, but as I did, I realized the path I had followed was gone. There was no clear trail through the moss and the undergrowth. Every direction looked the same. Dense trees, twisted roots, shadows that moved oddly in the waning sunlight. I checked my compass. It didn't seem to make sense. The forest was disorienting, and suddenly, I felt the full weight of how alone I was. I tried to retrace my steps. Every landmark I thought I remembered seemed wrong. A tree that had been on my left before now appeared on my right. A small rock formation I had passed looked entirely different. Panic began to set in, slow at first, then rising like a tide. I reminded myself to breathe, to stay calm. I knew the first rule of getting lost. Stop, stay put, and figure out where you were. I sat on a fallen log, trying to map the terrain in my mind. I knew the sun was low, maybe 2 hours from setting, and I had no idea where my campsite was. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I was moving again, desperate to find any familiar landmark. The forest had changed with the fading light. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, and every sound seemed amplified. A branch snapping made me jump, and I cursed myself for being so tense. The wind picked up, carrying with it that strange metallic smell again, stronger this time. My stomach churned. I tried to think rationally, but rational thoughts were hard to hold on to when every sense screamed danger. I found a small depression in the ground near some rocks and decided I had no choice but to make camp. The night was cold, far colder than the forecast had predicted. I gathered dry twigs and branches as best I could, starting a fire. It took forever. The wood was damp in places, and the wind kept blowing sparks away. But eventually, a small flame caught, and I fed it cautiously, circling it with stones. The firelight barely pierced the darkness beyond a few meters, and I could see the shadows of the trees swaying, forming strange shapes that my tired mind turned into threats. Hours passed. I lay in my sleeping bag, close to the fire, shivering despite my layers. Every noise made me tense. A distant howl, perhaps a coyote. A rustle in the underbrush, maybe a raccoon. But there was something different about the sounds this night. Closer, more deliberate. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving around me, watching, waiting. I had read about wild animals approaching campsites, but I hadn't expected it to feel like this. Like the forest itself had awareness and I was intruding. Morning came slowly. I felt no relief. The night had exhausted me, leaving my body sore and my mind frayed. I ate a little, drank water, and decided I needed to leave immediately. The forest might have been vast and confusing, but the most important thing now was survival. Find a clear path back, avoid further disorientation. I packed quickly, leaving nothing behind, and started walking. Hours passed. I followed a stream, reasoning that it would eventually lead somewhere, maybe a larger body of water or a trail. The forest seemed endless, every bend in the stream presenting the same dense undergrowth. My legs ached, my throat was dry, and the metallic smell returned, stronger than ever. At some point, I noticed footprints, human, not animal. They were fresh, leading in the same direction I was heading. I didn't know if they were friendly or hostile, but they were my only clue. I followed them carefully. The trail led me to a small clearing where an old cabin sat, abandoned but intact. The door hung loosely on its hinges, the windows grimy but unbroken. Relief washed over me. I checked the structure for safety. Nothing seemed dangerous inside. I found old firewood and started a fire for warmth and light. The cabin provided shelter, and for the first time in 2 days, I felt a momentary sense of security. That night, I stayed alert but managed a few hours of sleep. waking to the early light filtering through the grime-covered windows. I used my map and compass, marking the cabin as a reference point. Daylight revealed a faint trail nearby, overgrown but visible. I packed my things and started following it, careful to note landmarks. Hours of walking brought me to a Forest Service road. My pace quickened. Eventually, I saw a ranger's vehicle approaching. Relief turned to disbelief. I flagged them down, explaining my situation as best I could. They radioed in, and soon, a search team was on the way to ensure I had no injuries or further dangers. By the time I was back in my car, leaving the forest behind, I felt exhausted but safe. The fear that had clung to me in the dark, tangled woods was replaced by a profound sense of relief. I had survived, not because of luck, but because of preparation, caution, and the ability to stay calm under pressure. I thought about what had gone wrong, how easy it was to become disoriented, how quickly the forest could turn from serene to threatening. I made a mental note: never underestimate the wilderness, respect it, and always be ready for the unexpected. I had planned the trip for months. I had been working long hours in a city that seemed to never sleep, and the constant noise, the bright lights, and the endless movement had begun to wear me down. I wanted to get away from everything, to escape into the quiet of the wilderness where the only sounds were the wind, birds, and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I had picked a small, remote national forest in the north, far from roads, towns, or any other sign of human life. I had been there once before for a short-day hike, so I knew the terrain would be challenging but manageable. My plan was simple: hike in, set up camp near a small creek, spend a few days alone, and hike back out. I told myself it would be peaceful, restorative, and grounding. I was wrong about how peaceful it would be. I arrived early in the morning, just after sunrise, with my car loaded with a large backpack, a tent, a sleeping bag, enough food and water for 4 days, and some extra emergency gear. The forest trailhead was deserted, the parking lot empty except for my car. The air was crisp and smelled of pine and damp earth, and for a moment, I felt the kind of relief that only comes from stepping out of a world that is too loud. I slung my pack over my shoulders and began the hike. First, it was everything I had hoped for. The trail was narrow and winding, lined with tall pines and oaks, their branches forming a kind of natural tunnel. Birds darted in and out of the canopy, and the occasional chipmunk or squirrel scurried across the path. The sun was warm on my back, and the air carried that faint, clean smell of pine resin. I moved at a steady pace, stopping every so often to take a sip of water and rest my shoulders. I had no company, no phone signal, and no distractions, and at first, the solitude felt like a balm. By mid-afternoon, I reached the creek I had been aiming for. It was small, maybe 12 feet wide, but clear and fast-flowing. Moss-covered rocks lined its edges, and the water made a soothing, continuous murmur as it wound its way through the forest. I chose a flat spot a few yards from the bank, near a stand of pines that offered some cover from the wind, and began setting up my tent. The work was slow and deliberate. I measured carefully, hammered the stakes, and made sure the rain flap was secure, even though the forecast showed no rain. I laid out my sleeping bag, organized my gear, and set up my small portable stove, the act of routine keeping me calm and focused. Once my camp was ready, I decided to explore the surrounding area before it got dark. I followed a narrow trail that led further into the woods, trying to get my bearings. The forest thickened as I moved away from the creek. The light began to fade through the dense canopy, casting long shadows that made the trees seem taller, older, and more oppressive. I noticed that the forest floor here was uneven, with hidden roots and rocks that could easily twist an ankle. I kept my steps careful, scanning for anything out of place. That was when I first noticed it. A pair of footprints, half hidden in the soft mud near a fallen log. They were human. At first, I thought maybe someone else was camping in the area, but the prints were fresh. I compared them to the muddy soil near my own boots. They were too large to be mine and too deep to have been made hours ago. I felt a flicker of unease, but told myself I was being paranoid. People do hike in these forests. It wasn't unusual to see another human out here. I followed the footprints for a few minutes out of curiosity, but then they vanished into the dense undergrowth. I shrugged it off and headed back to camp, telling myself I would just make a note to stay alert. Night fell quickly, as it always does in the forest when the sun dips behind the trees. I cooked a simple meal over my stove, the flames dancing in the dim twilight, and listened to the creek as I ate. The forest sounded different at night. The birds were gone, replaced by the occasional rustle of a raccoon or the call of an owl. Every sound was sharper in the quiet. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, even the sound of my own breathing. I lay in my sleeping bag for a while, staring up at the dark mesh of my tent and thinking about how alone I was. I slept lightly that night, waking several times to the sounds outside. Once, I thought I heard someone moving near my tent, but when I shone my flashlight through the mesh, I saw nothing. My heart had been racing, but after a few tense moments, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I woke to the sound of the creek, the sunlight filtering through the trees, and the faint smell of wet pine. I had planned a longer hike that day, wanting to explore a ridge that overlooked the valley. I packed my gear carefully, made sure my water bottle was full, and set off. The trail was steep and rocky, and I moved slowly, my boots crunching on the loose stones. As I climbed, I noticed more signs of recent human activity. Another set of footprints, this time heading in the same direction as me. First, I thought it was just coincidence. Maybe someone else had camped nearby and taken the same path. But the prints were oddly spaced, irregular in a way that suggested someone had been moving cautiously, perhaps even slowly, as if trying not to make noise. The unease returned. I stopped several times to look around, but the forest appeared empty. No sound of voices, no movement in the trees, just the constant, whispering wind through the pines. By midday, I reached a small clearing near the ridge. The view was stunning. Rolling hills, rivers winding like ribbons, and distant mountains fading into the haze. I paused to eat, setting down my pack and taking out my water bottle. As I ate, I felt a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, an awareness that something was off. I glanced around and noticed the prints again, this time behind me. They hadn't been there when I had left the trail. Panic started to creep in. I quickly packed up, trying to act calm, and began descending the ridge faster than I should have, careful not to slip on the loose rocks. The prints followed me, moving parallel to my path, sometimes appearing closer, sometimes seeming to disappear only to reappear a few minutes later. I told myself it was probably another hiker, maybe someone enjoying the same trail, but I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. By late afternoon, I made it back to my camp near the creek. I decided to stay put for the rest of the day. I reinforced the tent, stacked extra firewood, and made sure my small stove was ready. I also dug a small trench around the perimeter of my tent, not because I thought it would keep anyone out, but because it gave me a sense of control in a situation where I felt I had none. That night, the sounds of the forest were worse. Couldn't sleep. Every rustle, snap, and whisper made my heart race. Around midnight, I heard something move in the trees, close enough that I could hear the crunch of branches. My flashlight barely penetrated the darkness, and I could see nothing, but I felt it. An awareness of someone or something moving in a deliberate, cautious way. I stayed still, holding my breath, hoping that whoever it was would leave. Didn't. The sounds circled my tent, moving slowly, stopping for long moments before continuing. I realized that it wasn't just footprints I had been seeing. It was someone following me, possibly watching my camp, waiting. I spent the rest of the night in a mix of fear and calculated vigilance. I kept my backpack ready, knife accessible, and my flashlight in hand. I didn't sleep, not really, just dozed lightly between waves of adrenaline. By the first gray light of dawn, I made a decision. I couldn't stay another night. The trail back out of the forest would be long and difficult, but staying meant risking whatever was watching me. I packed everything as quickly as possible, leaving nothing behind except the fire pit I had made. The hike out was tense. I kept my head on a swivel, scanning every movement in the trees. The forest, which had seemed peaceful and inviting on the way in, now felt hostile and alive with unseen watchers. I moved faster than I had on the way in, sometimes stumbling over roots or slipping on mud. I thought I heard someone moving behind me several times, but when I looked, there was nothing. Eventually, hours later, the trail began to open, the trees thinning as I neared a small dirt road. Relief flooded through me as I stepped onto the road, where I finally saw signs of civilization. Tire tracks, distant fences, and the sound of a truck engine in the distance. I walked toward the road until I could see a passing vehicle, then flagged it down. The driver was surprised to see me but stopped, and I got in, giving my story as best I could. They drove me to the nearest town, where I contacted the authorities and reported the situation. Search teams went back to the forest, and they later told me they found evidence of someone else camping in the area. Someone who had been following me but had left before they arrived. No arrests were made and no one was ever caught, but the prints and makeshift campsites confirmed that I had not imagined it. The experience left me shaken but also strangely grateful. I realized how careful planning, awareness, and quick thinking had kept me safe. I never returned to that forest, but I learned something important about wilderness survival and personal safety. No matter how much you think you are alone, there is always the possibility that someone else is watching, and you must be prepared for every eventuality. That knowledge stayed with me, and though it took months to shake the constant tension and paranoia, I eventually found a new respect for both the beauty and danger of the wild. I never went back to camping alone in remote areas after that, but I continued to enjoy nature in safer, more controlled environments, always keeping the lessons from that terrifying trip close in my mind. Even now, years later, whenever I hear a creak or walk through a dense forest, I remember the weight of those footsteps, the quiet, deliberate sounds circling my tent, and the way my heart raced through that long night. It was a fear I survived, and surviving it taught me to respect the wilderness, respect the unknown, and trust in my own ability to stay alert and safe. That trip, as terrifying as it was, left me stronger and more aware than I had ever been before.